calendar has switched over to September. Before we get started with today's event, I wanted to just do a few housekeeping items of upcoming events we have at National Review Institute. The first is this Friday, September 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern, when NR Editor-in-Chief Rich Lowry will lead a discussion with NRI Fellows Andy McCarthy, Jay Nordlinger, Richard Brookhiser, and Catherine Jean Lopez, who will reflect on the memories and experiences of living in New York at the time of the September 11th attacks and discuss lessons learned 2 decades later. That again is this Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. A couple weeks later, on October 1st, National Review Institute will be hosting an event with Pacific Legal Foundation, a virtual event, and the panel discussion will feature 3 of our nation's top Supreme litigators. The distinguished panel members will offer insights into the most significant cases of the upcoming term. That event is at noon Eastern, again on October 1st. And last but not least, hopefully you all have received an invitation to this year's William F. Buckley Jr. Prize Dinner. Those tickets are now on sale, and it will be held on October 21st in Dallas. We hope you'll join us to honor Eugene Meyer and Leonard Leo for their consequential advancement of the Federalist Society, and Adam Meyerson for his leadership of the Philanthropy Roundtable, as well as other major journalistic, policy, and philanthropic institutions. And for those of you who are donors on today's call, thank you so much for supporting the Institute. For those of you who are not, I would strongly encourage you to. We could absolutely use your fellowship and support, and we'd love to have you. As an added benefit, any donors at the $250 level get an invitation to our NRI Book Club, which in October, on October 6th, will feature the book we'll be discussing today and the author we're discussing today, Vivek Ramaswamy. So please, again, thank you for those of you who are already donors at that level. And if you're not yet, we encourage you to do so you can get an invitation to that upcoming book club. Today, to speak to us about his recent book is Vivek Ramaswamy. Boy, that's I have Ciancimino as a last name, and it's still kind of tough to get through that one. And Kevin Williamson. Vivek is a successful entrepreneur, has founded multiple successful enterprises, a first-generation American. He's the founder and executive chairman of Roivant Sciences, a new type of biopharmaceutical company focused on the application of technology drug development. He founded the company in 2014 and led the largest biotech IPOs of 2015 and 16, eventually culminating in successful clinical trials in multiple disease areas that led to FDA-approved products. Mr. Ramaswamy was born and raised in Southwest Ohio. He graduated summa cum laude in biology from Harvard in 2007 and began his career as a successful biotech investor at a prominent hedge fund. He continued to work as an investor while earning his law degree at Yale, where he was a recipient of the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans. He was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine in 2015 for his work in drug development. And in 2020, he emerged as a prominent commentator on stakeholder capitalism, free speech, and woke capitalism. He has authored numerous articles and op-eds which have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, Newsweek, and Harvard Business Review. He serves on the boards of the Philanthropy Roundtable, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and St. Xavier High School. In conversation today with Vivek is National Review's roving correspondent Kevin Williamson, who's written a bit about woke culture himself, including a great piece on the history of woke capitalism in the July issue of National Review magazine. Just a reminder that we will leave a few minutes at the end of the conversation for Q&A. You can use the chat box feature to enter your questions, and Kevin or Vivek will address them at the last few minutes of the conversation. Thank you again for joining us. Kevin, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm not sure we have any time left after running down Vivek's resume there. Maybe one of these days you'll do something with your life. Do you want to take just a couple of minutes and give us a sort of, 5-minute overview of the book and what it's about and why you wrote it and all that good stuff?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And then we can take it into conversation from there. In short, I wasn't born into elite America, despite the very generous biography that Chris just took the time to read. But I have lived it for the last 15 years. And I felt some sense of obligation to really lift the veil on what I see as the defining scam of our time, where if you're a business and you're in corporate America today, I think it applies to elite America broadly, but I focus especially on corporate America. You pretend like you care about something other than profit and power precisely to gain more of each. And that scam is now wreaking havoc on American democracy because it demands that a small group of institutional investors and CEOs determine what's good for the rest of society at large. Under the banner of stakeholder capitalism, what we've accidentally done, what some have done on purpose, is concentrated not just market power, but moral power, the power to determine our normative values, not in American democracy at large, but in the hands of a small group of institutional leaders. And I think that's wreaking havoc on democracy in a number of ways. First of all, I think that alone is a betrayal of American democracy and resembles that of the old world European model, where a number of church leaders and business leaders would get together and determine the common good. America, if anything, was a promise that actually we would determine those very questions through free speech, open debate in the public square through our democracy. But I think there's a couple of ways even further that it erodes democracy from within. And I think one of those we've seen unfold in the last decade is the loss of social solidarity as institutions in our private sector become politicized. And I think that a divided polity like ours depends on certain apolitical spaces, apolitical spheres that bring us together, irrespective of whether we're black or white, irrespective of whether we're Democrat or Republican. The baseball stadiums of this country used to provide those spaces. The football stadiums of this country used to provide those spaces. Our places of work, our museums, our philanthropic institutions, our orchestras used to provide those spaces. And as each of those spaces not just go woke, although I think that is a big part of the theme that I talk about in the book, but get infected with partisan politics, we lose the very spaces that bring us together and give us solidarity as a people despite our political division. So I think that's the second way in which democracy loses twice. I actually think democracy loses, American democracy in particular, loses a third time over when foreign actors have gotten in on the game. And the feature that progressives don't understand of the game that they have spawned is that once corporations are vectors to advance progressive agendas, they become vehicles to advance any agenda. And nobody has mastered that game better than the Communist Party of China, in my opinion, where they have been able to weaponize not just the COVID-19 pandemic, we can talk about that later too, but the woke pandemic, to be able to undermine the moral standing of the United States and create a false equivalence between the United States and China. And if you have any doubt about it, just listen really carefully to what they're saying in nearly every diplomatic setting. Xi Jinping last year, pressed by the EU on the human rights atrocities in the Xinjiang province committed against the Uyghurs, where, by the way, over 1 million Uyghurs are locked up in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilizations in some of the most offensive human rights abuses we have seen from a major nation, I think, since the Third Reich of Germany, who, by the way, Apple uses as slave labor to make their iPhones. It goes on and on. The first thing that Xi Jinping says is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. It's not an accident. If you listen earlier this year at the Alaska summit, his top diplomat, Yang Jiechi, came to Alaska and lectured us for 15 minutes on how China wanted to see the United States stop slaughtering Black Americans, his word, slaughtering, and that China hopes that the United States does better on human rights. Now, that would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that the new class of international arbiters of justice, the newly progressive woke corporations, are doing China's bidding for them by consistently criticizing the United States, but without saying a peep about actual human rights atrocities in China, revealing what I think is actually the great folly of American democratic capitalism over the course of the last 30 years. I refer to a philosophy born toward the end of the 20th century, which thought that we could spread democratic values by using capitalism as a vector, that we could use our money to get them to be more like us. And instead, actors like China have turned that game on its head by using their money to get us to be more like them, by turning our corporations like Disney and Nike and the NBA and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and Marriott and Airbnb, and I could go on as I do in the book, into Trojan horses that effectively undermine the United States from within by criticizing the US, praising China, all the while creating this false moral equivalence between the two great powers. And if we have one great asset of all on the geopolitical stage, it isn't our nuclear arsenal, in my opinion. It is our moral standing on the global stage. And by equating Chinese nihilism with American idealism, I think America is left eroded in the end. And that's what advertently or not, the newly progressive corporations have managed to do, as they still stay silent in China as a condition for doing business there. So those are some of the layers that I dig deeper and deeper into in the book, of how democracy loses not once but twice, not twice but thrice over, and in the face of the emergence of this newly politicized model of apologist capitalism. Call it woke capitalism, call it stakeholder capitalism. It's the reality of the modern private sector. And I felt compelled to write the book because, frankly, I've lived in those elite corridors. I was educated at Harvard and Yale. I've been an exchange student in China. I've done business in China. I've done business here in the United States. I've been an investor. I've been a CEO. I had to step down as CEO to be able to speak freely as I do about these contentious issues in the book. It was something that if you asked me 2 years ago, would I have written a book and had stepped down as CEO of the company that I had founded 7 years prior, I would have said you were crazy. Yet here we are. And I think a lot of my learnings over the last year made me realize that I had to ultimately walk the walk and practice what I was preaching, that even if I was speaking in my capacity as a citizen, but was CEO of a relatively prominent company, I needed to ultimately speak in an unvarnished way as a citizen without necessarily subjecting the business that I had previously led to the consequences of my speech. And so, that being the nature of the environment we lived in, I decided to wear my hat as a citizen and do something that I wasn't free to do as a CEO, which was to start talking openly again. And one of the prescriptions in the book is just that. In order to restore our culture of free speech that ultimately defeats our culture of fear that permeates every one of our institutions today in the face of sort of the woke infiltration, I think that the only way to fix that problem, whether you're on the left or on the right, is to start talking openly again. And that's what I've started to do as a citizen through writing the book. So, Kevin, happy to take the chat in any number of directions.
Cultural permeation you mentioned is kind of where I really wanted to start, because as you allude to, there's a geopolitical piece to this, there's a political economy piece to it, but there's also this basic question of how we live, what the cultural weather is like. I don't know if you followed this Warby Parker thing yesterday. I wrote about it this morning. One of their ads showed up on Daily Wire on Ben Shapiro's website, and there was the usual Twitter outcry, how can you support this stuff? Because we all know that Ben Shapiro is the worst human being who's ever lived, and a very, very dangerous man. And Warby Parker, of course, did what Warby Parker is going to do, which was say, oh, well, this was a third party thing, and we never would have done this, and we'll take steps to make sure that our ads never appear on a website like this again in the future, meaning anything that's conservative. And so setting aside the question of the particular politics and the policy differences and all the rest of it, I want to think about politics when I'm going to buy a pair of glasses. And I don't want to think about politics when I'm deciding, do I want this computer or that computer, or this phone plan or that phone plan? But we've entered into a situation where it permeates everything from what neighborhood do I live in? What sort of car do I drive? Where do I go to school? Where do I send my kids to school? What sort of church do I belong to? And this is, in a sense, a really radical expansion, not only of politics into life, but also of corporate power, which I think was one of the interesting aspects of your book, because businesses do play such a large role in this. So maybe talk a little bit about where the idea of stakeholder capitalism comes from. And then also what I think is a really interesting situation, which is that we have now decided to use employment as the main means of enforcing certain kinds of political and social and moral homogeneity in life.
Yeah. So Kevin,
which I think if you suggested to progressives 25 years ago that that's what's going to happen, they would have thought that was dystopian.
Yeah.
If you had said American businesses are going to determine the limits of public discourse, and they're going to do this by deploying capital and by weaponizing employment. But of course, once they got a little bit of power, people decided they liked using that power.
So Kevin, so much to say there. I actually do want to come back to, I think, the most important part of that, which is actually the cultural commentary of how we got to the farcical places where we choose our sandwiches based on our politics, and our sandwich makers advertise to us based on their politics. I want to get to that later, but that is a deeper discussion that's cultural in nature. I want to address the other part of your question, which is where this notion of stakeholder capitalism came from. I think there's version 1.0 and I think there's version 2.0. Version 1.0 was sort of a debate between Klaus Schwab and Milton Friedman and the economists in their respective lanes dating back to the 1970s, where Milton Friedman said the proper role of a corporation is to pursue profitability through selling products and services. And he worried that the expansion of politics into the sphere of business was going to infect business to make it less efficient at generating profits, the very thing that a corporation was supposed to do. The social purpose of a corporation is to pursue profit, he famously said. And, I think that my concern is in some ways the inverse of Milton Friedman's concern. I share his concern to some extent, but my concern is actually the opposite. It is that the expansion of business into our polity is actually going to render democracy really a sham in the end. And that was something that Milton Friedman didn't quite explore to the same extent. And I think one of the pieces of unfinished work that I think Milton Friedman did in this debate was he never really responded to what I thought of as the best critique from the other side of shareholder capitalism and the best argument for stakeholder capitalism. That is the idea that a corporation should serve not just its shareholders, but all stakeholders. And that argument was that in return for the great benefits that society gave corporations, benefits like limited liability for shareholders, where shareholders aren't liable for the liabilities of a corporation, those are societally invented legal fictions that we created to allow corporations to exist. And in return for that, the Klaus Schwab, Davos crowd types will say, what we expect is that corporations owe an implicit debt in return to the rest of society. Milton Friedman never really responded to that. He would just sort of assert that no such thing ever existed. There was no implicit grand bargain. One of the things I do in my book is actually offer a retracing, drawing a line through U.S. corporate history that I think hadn't been drawn before this book, which is to actually not only concede that point, but to embrace that point. I think it's true that there was a grand bargain at the inception of the corporation in return for these great gifts like limited liability. It just wasn't the grand bargain that progressives and stakeholder capitalists surmise. It wasn't an implicit, unspoken grand bargain. I actually argue it was an explicit grand bargain. And the explicit grand bargain was that in return for these great gifts that have made the modern corporation so powerful, including limited liability at the top of that list, society was smart about it. American society was smart about it. We said that actually our demand is that the directors of those corporations owe a fiduciary duty only to maximize profit to shareholders, not just to make those shareholders more wealthy, but to protect the rest of society from corporate overreach. That once we've created these insulated creatures, these Frankensteinian monsters, Dr. Frankenstein wants his monster to stay in the cage, because once he leaves that cage, the cage of capitalism, the cage of the market, he's then free to roam free over the other spheres of our lives, ranging from family life to religious life to democratic and civic life. So that I think really matches on to a lot of the corporate history I lay out. Usually you would get a corporate charter back in the 1800s and even early 1900s in return for applying for a corporate charter and benefits like limited liability. All you could do was go build a bridge. And if you did anything else, you would lose those benefits that the state gave you. So that's kind of one of the pieces of wonkier history that I trace in the book. Now, I think that this philosophy actually got supercharged with sort of a newly woke progressive brand of stakeholder capitalism in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. I remember this vividly because I actually got my first job in New York City. I had graduated from Harvard with a degree in molecular biology, but ended up joining a hedge fund doing biotech investing. That was in the fall of 2007. I saw the 08 crisis from a front row seat. The fund I worked for was sort of prominently discussed in The Big Short. So I had a somewhat of a front row ticket to this. And I think what happened after the 08 crisis was that the old left thought that corporations were the bad guys. You wanted to redistribute money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and give it to poor people. Agree or not, that's what the old left had to say. But there was the birth of this new diversity, identity politics obsessed, newly woke progressive left. Barack Obama, first Black president of the United States. There was this new movement on the left that said actually the real problem in the United States wasn't economic injustice. It wasn't quite poverty per se. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for many segments of big business in this country to say that actually we could go from being the bad guys to being the good guys if we just said the right things. Applaud diversity and inclusion, put some token minorities on your boards, muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos, whatever it is you do. This was actually pretty easy by comparison. And so what they said is, okay, we're going to lend our market power, we're going to lend our money, we're going to lend our legitimacy to this newly woke progressive wing of the left. But in return, we kind of expect that the new left looks the other way when it comes to the concerns of the old left as it pertains to corporate power. And so that was the birth of this arranged marriage, where basically you had a bunch of big banks that got together post 2008 with a bunch of woke millennials. Together, they birthed woke capitalism. And they used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. Today, we barely remember what that was. And so that was sort of the beginning of this arranged marriage between the newly woke progressive left and big business in this country. It was less even of a marriage. It was more like mutual prostitution. Each side still secretly has disdain for the other. And any marriage in which one side has scorn for the other probably isn't going to end very well. But right now, and for the last decade, it has been working because each side got something out of the trade. Silicon Valley, doubly so, where they effectively jumped on that bandwagon and said, actually, if we have the power to curate dialogue online, we could actually do some big favors for the newly woke progressive left. But we won't quite do it for free without the expectation that the new Democratic Party effectively looks the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact, the kinds of things that used to bother the old left. And so, eventually that spread to the rest of corporate America. And I detail the spread to the rest of corporate America in the book on how that grand bargain works, on how that act of prostitution, mutual prostitution, really works. But the net result is the birth of what I think of as the illegitimate child of that act, which is the rise of the woke industrial complex, a new Leviathan that is far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago. I think it's more powerful than what our founding fathers feared 250 years ago, because Hobbes and George Washington alike thought of big government as the threat that would be the biggest infringement upon individual liberty, that at least posed the biggest threat to infringing on individual liberty and prosperity. And what we have today is, I think, a new world in which big government only represents half the story. It is this new hybrid of big government and big business, this woke industrial complex, that I think actually represents the real threat to liberty, as you pointed out, in our places of work, in our private sector, that restrict the liberty of everyday Americans in their lived experience of their everyday lives, even when they're not technically interfacing with the government directly. And that's what the heart of this book is all about, is really recognizing that new threat to liberty in a way that requires, I think, a new vision for not just the conservative movement, but the American movement to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's sort of where I wanted to take things, because there's this naive libertarian critique of these current arrangements. And it says something along the lines of, well, Twitter's not the government, and Facebook's not the government, and Google's not the government. So when they do X, Y, and Z, it's not really censorship per se. And then we treat that in some cases as though it were the end of the conversation, when of course there's a great deal more to the conversation. So you argue that in some ways, these private actors provide a backdoor for elected officials, people in government, bureaucrats, and political actors to achieve certain political ends without using the machinery of the state to do it, and therefore not running into things like First Amendment jurisprudence.
Yeah, well, I argue that right now, that is the accepted dogma. And I make the case that we need to revise that dogma as we head into recognizing the brave new world that we're actually in. It isn't the idyllic 1980s. And it's kind of like what Dorothy might have said to Toto, as I say in the book, we're not in 1980 anymore. And I think we need to recognize the essence of what's happening today, which is exactly what you described, which is, really what the middle of the book is all about, is describing crony capitalism 2.0, not private companies just bribing the government to win competitive advantages over their competitors, but government in return bribing private companies to do through the back door what government cannot directly effectuate under the Constitution. I think big tech censorship is at the top of that list. Of course, the example you said is, you cited Twitter, or for example, Facebook. You could say something similar. These are private companies. They're free to determine what does and doesn't show up on their websites. That's true, in my opinion, so long as they're acting as private companies. But if they're acting at behest of governmental threats, in direct coordination with the government, and protected by a special form of federal immunity from state tort law when doing so in the form of Section 230, especially 230C2, which, by the way, is the only statute I know of that specifically says whether or not such speech is constitutionally protected. So it was a statute that's designed to sidestep a constitutional prohibition that then allows the government to threaten, coordinate with, or whatever, work with private companies to censor content that the government, by definition, by the text of 230 itself, could not censor directly. That's just state action in disguise. And
Can you give us an example of that coordination?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I've written a couple op-eds in the Wall Street Journal about it earlier this year, one of which actually was the prompt to me waking up to the fact that I couldn't write about these issues without having an impact on my company. I had several advisors resign after I wrote my first of these op-eds. So I decided to write a second one after I stepped down as CEO, and much of this is laid out in more detail in the book. But many senators, Richard Blumenthal to House Representatives members, Cedric Richmond, have issued threats to social media companies over the last year. I'm going to use almost exact quotes. We're going to regulate you. We're going to make it aggressive. We're going to make it swift. We're going to make it punitive, unless you take down hate speech and misinformation, by the way, as defined by the party in power. So then these companies go out to the other coast and they decide that actually they were threatened to do something. Then the day before Facebook's next hearing, they announced their next round of misinformation and hate speech policies the day before the next one of those hearings. And they're, of course, protected by Section 230 immunity to do it. Same thing happening now with respect to managing so-called COVID misinformation. Jen Psaki recently boasted from the White House press conference room that the government is coordinating with Facebook, is coordinating with social media actors to eliminate the spread of COVID-related misinformation. The Surgeon General actually called on social media companies to be doing more to actually snuff out what they deem to be falsehoods or misinformation, one of which was actually about the origin of this virus, by the way. So Facebook, if you posted about 7 months ago on Facebook that the coronavirus pandemic originated in a lab in China, your post would have been taken down, and there's a good chance your account would have been locked for violating their standards on COVID-related misinformation. So there's just the merits of underlying censorship itself, which is, a general view that I have that I think a lot of your audience may share, that the answer to bad speech isn't less speech, it's more speech, and that whole, debate about our free speech culture. But the point I'm making is a legal argument on top of that, which is to say that if the government cannot directly censor speech under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, there's exceptions to the First Amendment, but whatever those rare exceptions are to speech, hardcore political speech, you can't censor that if you're the government, then nor can you as the government, under current Supreme Court jurisprudence, as I lay out in the book, nor can you delegate to a private party to do that dirty work instead at behest of threats. And there's a famous case called Brentwood, which basically lays out three different standards, either threats or through special forms of immunity or through willful participation in a joint activity. Those are the three standards. And what we've actually seen from the US federal government this calendar year alone is all three of those: threats, willful participation in a joint activity. You see the government working with Facebook, and any form of immunizing private behavior that the government can't actually effectuate directly. That's Section 230. And, I think that there was a liberal critique of this recent abortion law that was passed in Texas, which deputizes private companies to be able to bring civil suit against anyone who facilitates an abortion. There was a lot of outrage on the left about the government the state government unconstitutionally sidestepping Roe v. Wade to be able to deputize private companies, private parties to be able to do what the state government couldn't do directly. I think what we're seeing with respect to the censorship of speech online is that same principle on steroids. And I lay out a wide range of cases that go beyond big tech in the book too. One of my favorite examples is one that I think a lot of people aren't aware of behavior that began in the Obama administration, is now continuing in the Biden administration, which was to get funding that you couldn't get through Congress to be able to use the DOJ of all institutions, the DOJ, to fund those same causes. Now, what could that possibly mean? Well, what happened is, I go back to the 2008 financial crisis. After the 2008 crisis, the Obama administration reached massive multi-billion-dollar, sometimes $10+ billion settlements with big banks in New York City, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and so forth. Now, at the same time, the Obama administration was trying to use the budgeting process to fund woke left-wing nonprofits. By woke, just to define it, I mean race-obsessed, gender-obsessed, and sexual orientation-obsessed progressive causes, to fund nonprofits like La Raza, the National Urban League, and so forth. And Congress said no. Maybe you're on the left, maybe you're on the right. Wherever you are, that's life in a two-party system. Call it obstructionist, call it what you want. That's how our constitutional system of checks and balances and budgeting works. Well, what the Obama administration then did is they actually went to their DOJ and said, okay, we know you reached tens of billions of dollars worth of settlement with these big banks. Go to those banks and make them a deal. And the deal was this: for every dollar that you owe to the public fisc, we'll give you $2, in some cases more than $2 off, if you donate just one of those dollars to La Raza or the National Urban League or any number of these other nonprofits that Congress refused to fund. So for the banks, this is great, because banks, being fond of money, love to pay less money so that they get more than a 2-for-1 offset. They also get a tax deduction if it's a 501c3 institution. And by the way, your press release looks a lot better when you talk about making a donation to the National Urban League than when you do to settle a criminal suit with the DOJ. So everybody wins in the process. everybody gets to wet their beak, but the real losers are the American people and our process of constitutional democracy as we know it. These are just a couple of examples from big tech censorship to congressional budgeting, but it's a big part of what I lay out in the book, where government is using private enterprise to do through the back door what it cannot directly do through the front door. And that's far more frightening than what George Orwell ever imagined. And I think both George Orwell and George Washington are both rolling in their grave, failing to recognize that actually we have a fourth branch of government that operates extra constitutionally outside the bounds of our constitutional system of checks and balances. It's really, and increasingly a government that's implemented through places like Silicon Valley with branch offices in places like Washington, D.C., that ultimately have rendered the American democratic process hollow. And I think everyday Americans who may not have gone to law school or whatever along the way understand that. They feel it in their bones. They understand what that threat to liberty means to them and the way they experience it every day. I think they're unable to articulate it when both conservatives and liberals have been beholden to philosophies that are sort of decades old and built for an era in which big government was the sole threat to liberty and prosperity through the front door. But part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to move that conversation and to provide a conceptual vocabulary to be able to more precisely describe the essence of what's happening today.
Thanks. Folks, if you have any questions, do put them in the chat box and I will relay them. But one more question from me. Conservatives particularly feel victimized by this stuff. It seems to not exclusively, but overwhelmingly go in one direction and come from one direction. Now, I don't want to see a right-wing version of wokeness, and I don't really want to see a right-wing version of cancel culture, and conservatives have never been particularly good at boycotting and those sorts of things. It's just not really in our political DNA. What, if anything, should we be doing in response?
Sure, yeah. So I'm with you first, Kevin, is that I think there's two ways this culture war ends. One is with a bang and one is with a whimper. I worry it ends with a whimper. And what I mean by that is that actually the way it could end is that both sides end up joining the same church under a different name, practicing cancel culture in reverse, embracing victimhood culture in response. And I'm personally deeply worried about the spread of victimhood culture in every direction in American life. Yes, it did start with the woke progressive left, but now every segment of American society is competing to be the greater victim. And I don't think that's going to be our way to rediscover a shared conception of American excellence, which is what I think part of our cultural solution will ultimately demand. But that's a deeper conversation we can have. I also don't want to see two versions of baseball or two versions of coffee, as we now see today, Black Rifle Coffee or Starbucks, or two versions of where you buy your pillows. I think that there's probably a great opportunity out there for a right-wing entrepreneur to make the alt-right version of Nike or of any other, or Coca-Cola or any other consumer good that ultimately decides to pledge fealty to this new woke religion.
Liberty soda.
Exactly. I mean,
Diet Liberty.
If this were a Shark Tank and I was I was trying to decide whether there's a half competent entrepreneur in charge, I'd say it probably would even make for pretty good investment. I don't think it's good for America because as I said earlier, I think we need an apolitical private sector to be able to bind us together across our political differences. And once we see a Republican version of baseball and a Democratic version of baseball, I think that's the beginning of the end of the American experiment as we know it. I think if you study anything about the last Civil War, in the 1860s, it actually began with the division and the great sorting of ourselves into two economies. Yes, it was morally about slavery, but more fundamentally, it was about a country that was no longer bound together by a shared private sector in which you could sort out your political space differences in spaces that didn't involve your economic and private life. That's a place that I worry we may be in the earliest stages of tending towards today. So the question you asked is, what do we do about it? I lay out probably three categories of solutions in the book. I'd say, maybe more, but broadly in three buckets. One are policy solutions, as distinct from legal solutions, which are legal arguments that I think victims of the new culture can ultimately pursue in court, which is different still from fundamental cultural solutions, which I think are by far the most important, by far the most difficult to actually implement in a predictable way. So I'll talk about the policy solutions, which in some ways are the easiest, at least to discuss in a short way. I think we need to recognize We need policy solutions that recognize that the new hybrid between the progressive big government vision and big business is actually a defining threat to liberty today. One that I raise in the book for discussion is adding political belief as a protected class right up there next to race, sex, religion, and national origin in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Now, the libertarian side of my brain, and I was alluding to this earlier, you were alluding to this earlier, would say that actually the last thing we should want to do is impose another constraint on a private business by telling them what they can and can't do. And that the market should be able to work out this kind of inefficiency, that if all of these businesses over here are firing all of these great conservative employees, that creates a great opportunity for another business over here to hire them, and the market should work that out. There's some logic to that. My main issue, and I have a lot of issues with that line of reasoning. I used to think this way myself, by the way, but my main issue with this line of reasoning is we can't apply a double standard where we reject the market's ability to police discrimination on the basis of sex, or race, or religion, or national origin, or as of last year, post the Bostock case, sexual orientation. But somehow, unquestioningly, accept the market's ability to correct for political discrimination. I think that if you can't discriminate or deplatform somebody or fire somebody for being Black or gay or Muslim or Christian or white or Jewish or whatever, then you should not be able to fire or deplatform them just for being an outspoken conservative or an outspoken liberal, though today it's clearly more relevant about being a conservative instead. And this is not an academic issue. It is happening every day in this country. Somebody was fired for wearing a Trump hat ahead of the 2020 election. Somebody was fired for accidentally, by the way, this is one of the most egregious cases, accidentally making the so-called OK symbol, which is associated with white supremacy in some, according to some narrator's description of it. Donald Trump himself, the 45th president of the United States, cannot access his Twitter account and cannot access his Facebook account, even as members of the Taliban continue to do just that. That's the moment we live in. It's not an academic issue. And if it can happen to the 45th president of the United States, it can happen to anybody. And so a lot of the solutions that I sort of talk about, I won't bore you with all of them here. Some of them relate to Section 230 reform, effectively saying that if you're acting in coordination with the state and you're protected by federal government immunity, then you're bound by the same standards of the federal government itself, namely the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And if you want to behave as a private company, great, do that just like any other private company. But if you want to be a private company that gets a federal form of immunity, you ultimately are bound by some of the same constraints as the federal government itself. Those are the kinds of policy solutions I talk about in the book. Basically, policy solutions that come down to the simple legal principle of you can't have it both ways. The second category is, and I won't sort of drone on about it here, Kevin, but I talk about even without a change in law, how under existing law, you would be able to potentially litigate those very issues: politically motivated firings in the workplace, politically forced pledges of allegiance to the new secular religion of wokeness through so-called DEI-based training. How could people, ultimately resist that even within the current legal system, certainly perhaps of foremost importance in our schools. And then I think the third category of solutions is really far deeper, which are to recreate, I think, a shared American identity around the ideals that we actually share together and are bound by as one people. I speak for my generation in this part of the book, where I describe myself as I am a millennial. And, I think my generation and people younger, what's that?
But I'm sorry to hear that. It's a terrible burden to live under. But
it's interesting. It's interesting when I sort of look around and see my peer group and now, a whole generation younger than me. We're hungry for a purpose, right? We're hungry for meaning. We're hungry for a cause. We have a moral hunger that we're trying to satisfy with the equivalent of fast food with wokeism. And I think what we actually hunger for is more substantial fare. And, I as you said, I don't think the right answer is going to end up being to cancel wokeism in return. It is going to be to dilute the woke agenda to irrelevance by filling that moral void at the heart of our American identity and at the heart of our American soul with a shared conception of what it actually means to be American in the year 2021. I think we lack a good answer to that question. I think our lack of an answer to that question is the black hole at the center of America. I think wokeism is the opium that fills that vacuum when you have a black hole that runs that deep. And I think the right answer is to revive a new shared vision of Americanism for the 2020s that answer the question of who we are across all of our diversity. If the last decade was our diversity decade of celebrating our diversity and differences as a people, I think we had to have a sort of focused effort in the next decade to revive our shared sense of who we are as one people across that diversity. And that is easier said than done. That is hard work. it's the work we need to do, I think, both as conservatives and as Americans. And that's probably my top concern in the book.
Yeah. You mentioned religious discrimination in passing, and it seems to me often that this is kind of a pretty good metaphor for what we're going through. I remember years ago, I was living in a largely Irish American neighborhood in Philadelphia, and I went into a bar and I ordered a Bushmills, and the bartender said, I've seen you at Mass. And I said, well, yeah. I said, well, Bushmills is Protestant whiskey. You know, we drink Jameson's. And so we don't really want our coffee and everything else in life to be like that. But the thing is, the Catholic Protestant thing was pretty funny and amusing if you're in the United States in the 21st century. It's a lot less funny and amusing if you were in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s, which I'm afraid we're moving toward a situation like that. The interesting thing about that, from my point of view, always was that in these famous Catholic Protestant confrontations in Northern Ireland were largely among people who were not actually particularly religiously devout. It was a question of cultural identity and what sort of person am I. I think we see a lot of this in the sort of wokeism as well, where you're actually dealing with people who don't have particularly well-developed political ideas. Certainly not anything I think would rise to the level of philosophy or an ideology, but a sort of sense of who their enemies are and an enemies list. One of our guests would like you to expand a little more on something you mentioned earlier, which is the role of the public schools in this, and the role of educational institutions and the ways in which they have become missionaries, in a sense, for this wokist view.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple things going on there. One of them is parallel to what we see in corporate America, which is the use of these newly woke values to deflect accountability for the failures of the public schools themselves, right? So the new movement in the woke education front is the idea that math, 2 + 2 = 4, that math is racist. That is, I think, a smokescreen. It is woke smoke to cover up the fact that actually minority kids are not being taught math very well in our public schools, in our cities. And I think that it's a lot easier to call math racist than it is to hold yourself accountable for teaching kids how to actually do math in a proficient way, in an age-adjusted and grade-adjusted way. So I think that in a certain sense, like it was for corporate America after the 2008 financial crisis, wokeism is a godsend for, I think, often union-protected classes of teachers that ultimately don't want to be held accountable for their poor results and would like to blame somebody else for that philosophy. Now, that's a bit of a cynical explanation, but I think there's truth to it. I think part of what's going on is also an agenda that has managed to get ahead of the American agenda, which is to say the American agenda would be one in our educational system that creates a common set of American values that foreground civic education in our country, that foreground from a young age, teaching kids what it actually means to be American, defined on the basis of the ideals that we share and espouse as one people. And I think that we have more of a vacuum left in that wake through the disappearance of patriotism over the last decade in particular, I would say, as we have lost common crises, even like, as dare I say, as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Of course, we wish something like that to never happen again. But I was in high school and I was in U.S. history class when those two planes hit the Twin Towers. And I gave my high school commencement address this year to a group of students who weren't born on the day that those two planes hit the Twin Towers. It was the first year that there was everyone graduating in the same class, none of whom were born on that day. And I think there was something to be said for not having lived in a moment where we remember coming together as one people, even if it meant as one people to fight a shared tragedy that we have since missed. And I think that our human impulse and the need for faith and for belief doesn't disappear even when we stop believing in things like our country or God. And I think that we have relocated that belief to a new belief system that's a secular religion. It's a religion nonetheless, but a secular religion that teaches you that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation. And for that movement and for that religion, they've realized that they can actually get ahead if they can actually win the battle for the next generation before anyone noticed. And so I think that part of it's a cynical arrangement that allows teachers and teachers unions and public school systems that have failed to be able to deflect accountability. But I think part of it is a concerted agenda to realize that actually, wokeism doesn't really survive the test of free speech and open debate very well. And so the art that it's mastered is actually how to deflect and avoid free speech and open debate. There's many ways in which wokeism has managed to sidestep free speech and open debate in American democracy and American public life. One of them is by leveling the threat of racism against you if you disagree with any of its views. And I think that there's no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. That's one of the ways they sidestep it. But the other way they sidestep it is actually to go upstream of when you have fully formed adults or fully formed minds that can engage in free speech and open debate by trying to pollute that new generation. And so one of the things I talk about in the book, somewhat controversially, perhaps even with this audience, is implementing civic service, mandated universal civic service into primary education, into summer break in particular, to sort of turn on its head the teachers union logic of actually summer break, though it was invented in an agrarian culture, has been a vestige of modern education only because of teachers unions, because it is viewed as a perk of being a public school teacher. I actually think that could be a great opportunity to weave shared civic service and civic education into American education in a way that revives that shared Americanism that dilutes the woke agenda to irrelevance. And it takes a bit of a book to write it, so I won't go into all of the details of why I think that's going to be constructive, even in the face of all the risks that such a program would raise. But those are the kinds of solutions that I think we need to be talking about to be able to dilute the woke agenda in education out of the picture.
I have another question from another guest, a question which I can summarize in 2 sets of 3 letters each. The first 3 letters are SEC. The next 3 are ESG.
Yeah, these always come in threes, and then I would also throw DEI onto that list, which is sort of a close cousin of the ESG movement.
Some people may not know DEI.
Yeah, they'll know what I mean. Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right.
So so I testified before Congress and the Senate earlier this year on their potential rules that they would consider to mandate so-called ESG, environmental, social, governance related disclosures from public companies. And that's really just codifying what has been a voluntary movement in the private sector that we've already seen, led by the likes of BlackRock and Larry Fink, to say that companies will only invest, or large asset management institutions will only invest in companies that embody their own values on environmental or social questions. So I think that the ESG movement is sort of a vector in corporate America to advance an agenda that both empowers the people who are atop the ESG industrial complex. I put Larry Fink at the top of that list. It's been a highly profitable, let's just say government industrial complex that has, that has really charged a lot of fees already. And I think that there's gotten a lot of funds flowing into that asset class, which allows at least certain contrived analyses to prove that ESG investing outperforms normal value investing. Because if you look at recent stock price performance, depending on how you cut the data, it's actually not so clear when you cut it in an even-handed way. But you have people, there's a woman in the Bank of America who is the head of ESG research, who unsurprisingly concluded that ESG investing outperforms normal modes of value investing. She would be out of a job if she came up with the opposite conclusion, of course. But that has actually proven to be quite a lucrative business that sidesteps one of the threats to the conventional active management industry and the mutual fund industry, which is that passive index funds were actually doing just as well as fee charging mutual funds. They needed to create a new justification for their own existence. That was part of the birth of the ESG movement. But I think that, part of it also reflects the government's ability to be able to do through the back door, again, what it couldn't through the front door. Just take the Green New Deal, for example. John Kerry is the climate czar under President Biden, and they certainly couldn't pass the Green New Deal through Congress, even a democratically controlled one, if they tried. But what they are doing is they're using John, and he's boasting about it, just like Jen Psaki, by the way. They don't make it that hard to discover what they're doing when they, perhaps without the consultation of legal counsel, boast about it in public, is boasting about his relationships with the banking CEOs on Wall Street to be able to get them to sign a climate pledge where they refuse to lend to the kinds of projects, all of them as a cartel, refuse to lend to the kinds of projects, Arctic drilling, et cetera, that the government couldn't democratically actually pass a ban towards doing through Congress anyway. And so, I think the ESG movement is one way that the government has, I think, captured private industry. Usually you talk about capture in the other direction, but I think it's a reverse kind of capture that ultimately, is really allowing the government to do far more than we imagine government to be able to do through a system of checks and balances. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing today is that mutual back scratching, I think, isn't really transparent to the rest of the American people. I think most people, if they knew, and most people probably have their money directly or indirectly invested in BlackRock. It's the world's largest asset manager has over $1 trillion of assets under management, if they knew exactly how their shares were being voted, how Larry Fink was using his custodianship of their shares, it's the fiduciary duty of the highest order, even more than what a CEO owes to his shareholders, is what a custodian of somebody's shares or dollars owes to the person who they're holding that money or those shares for. How they're voting their shares that belong to the individual pensioner, they're being voted by Larry Fink to advance a social agenda. Their blood would be boiling if they knew. They don't. So I think once they read the book, now they know. That's part of my point of putting a spotlight on it. And I personally think there's a question about the SEC. I think that if anybody were making claims about investment performance, like the likes of BlackRock are making, but it were about any other asset class that weren't ESG related on the basis of the scant data sets that they do, justifying superior performance or whatever, the SEC would be going after them. Instead, now they're in bed with the SEC to advance that very agenda, and everyone gets paid along the way to do it. So, part of the first step towards a solution is transparency on what's a complicated problem, and that's a big part of what I do in the middle of the book.
There was an action movie made some years ago in which Jean-Claude Van Damme plays a villain whose name is Villain, although he pronounces it Villain. How great is it that the villain of our story's name is Fink? Just,
one of many villains, but I definitely put him on the list.
Yeah. Why isn't there, someone asks, a good version of Twitter or Google, an unwoke version of these companies? Why hasn't the market corrected for these shenanigans and misbehavior?
Yeah. So look, I think that first of all, there's a network effect in a lot of these businesses. I think that there's a threshold that begets greater power for companies that have already achieved a certain status. So I think that that's particularly true in network effect businesses, like for Twitter, like for Facebook, like for Google. I think that Section 230 was probably a bad law when it was passed, but right now, if you repeal Section 230, you're actually just going to further empower those very incumbents to be able to withstand liability. So there's no clean, easy solution to that. And I think that the question, I just want to pause to make an important point that I didn't make before, but this question reminds me of, is that I do think there's a distinction between stakeholder capitalism, even wokeism, as applied to small mom and shop businesses or a restaurant that wants to have a counter serve that also stands for certain social values, and our reactive attitudes towards that versus our reactive attitudes towards the largest asset managers in the world and the largest social media companies in the world and the largest publishers and media companies in the world, which are effectively some of the companies that were named to that question, adopting that same ideology. Because in one case, you still have a marketplace of ideas in which an actor in the product marketplace is just one participant. But the real peril is when you have actors who exercise undue influence in the marketplace of products, but that use that market power to even more frighteningly flex their muscle in the marketplace of ideas. So I think that the intersection with wokeness and capitalism, but also the intersection between woke capitalism and raw economic power is not irrelevant to the way we ought to look at these issues. Now, why is there no unwoke version? I think part of it's a network effect, a path dependence to getting to where we are. The second is, I think that it has been quite profitable to further create moats for those businesses to be able to do in part the bidding of the new Democratic Party, so long as the new Democratic Party does their bidding back in reverse. You'll recall that Google, Facebook, and Twitter, I think all three of them, certainly Google and Facebook, came out publicly against the FCC's net neutrality, in favor of the FCC's net neutrality rules that would have prevented broadband providers from charging differential rates, for example, on the basis of somebody's content. Well, that actually weighs pretty heavily on Democratic lawmakers. But what do they expect in return is that then gives them a monopoly on which companies in the entire cascade, in the entire supply chain, if you will, of the modern internet, are able to then exercise their censorship in their own purview. So if Verizon can't, and Fios and Spectrum can't do it, which is what net neutrality would ultimately say, is that those cable and broadband providers can't engage in discrimination on the basis of their rates. Guess what? That gives Facebook and Google and the social media platforms even greater power to be able to have a monopoly on who in the private sector is able to engage in content-based censorship itself. And so I think that it's been in part not just the network effect, but the way they've been able to use woke progressivism to capture government, to be able to empower them, to be able to prevent the rise of those other competitors, nowhere better than in the case of Parler. You saw at the start of this year where Amazon and Apple and really Silicon Valley and Google, all of them worked together from Amazon Web Services to deplatforming them from the App Store, we're able to then use that market power to be able to ultimately prevent the emergence of ideological competition.
Yep. We're getting to the end of our time. Is there anything you'd like to say in summary or in closing besides buy my book?
Yeah,
Whichever
well, I mean,
sure.
I'm not intending, this is not a money-making venture for me, or not intended as one. If I net any profits out of this from a personal perspective, I intend to donate it back to the agenda anyway, of really, I think, reviving that shared American spirit that I think dilutes this agenda to irrelevance. I do care a lot about getting the message out there and starting to talk more openly about the kinds of issues, whether you're on the left or on the right, that a culture of fear prevents us from being able to talk about today. And I do think that question we ever so briefly touched on earlier, that question of what it means to be an American in the modern day, is at the heart of all of this. The relationship between capitalism and democracy, the relationship between the woke movement and the old left, the left and the right. I think the real question at the center of all of it is reviving an ideals-based vision for American identity that we have long missed in this country. And I think that I'm writing from a first personal perspective as somebody who's had the benefit of living some of those ideals. The ideal I probably put at the top of the list is the American dream. The idea that no matter who you are or where your parents came from or what language they spoke or what your skin color is, you can achieve anything you ever want in this country with your own hard work and commitment and your own dedication. And I think the issue with woke culture to me is that we woke up from that dream. And once you wake up from a dream, you really forget what it was all about. And I think that's the phase we're in as Americans today, is we forgot what that dream was. We still remember a little bit of what it felt like, but I think the right answer is to, I describe a lot of what's happening in the woke capitalist game as a magic trick, but it's not enough of a magic trick. No one would applaud if you just make something disappear. You have to bring it back. And I think that's a big part of what I'm focused on doing in the book, is completing the third part of that act.
All right. And thank you so much for your time. And I wish you the best of luck for everything. This conversation, of course, is a reminder to me, and I suppose to everyone else, that there are only a certain number of places where we can have conversations of this sort in this way, and National Review is one of them. Your support and your friendship and your readership makes that possible for us. Thank you for that. And thank you, everyone, for coming in today. And thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.